This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
10% of pediatric cancer is linked to a single gene variation. These variants can be detected in embryos before pregnancy begins. Orchid's whole genome reports can help mitigate your child's risk for cancer by screening for 90-plus genetic variants linked to pediatric cancer. Discuss embryo screening and IVF with a genetics expert. Hey, everybody. This is Razib with the Unsupervised Learning podcast. And I have a very special guest, another Substacker, guy who's, coming up in the Substack rankings, although I think they've de-emphasized the rankings, but you guys know where to find them. Ryan Burge. He is a professor, a political scientist, statistician, and American Baptist pastor. And he's a professor at Eastern Illinois University. And I know him because he produces a lot of infographics on religion, a lot of them on American religion. And, they kind of go viral all the time. And so, I subscribe. I'm a subscriber to his Substack, and I've wanted to have him on for a while. And I just decided to pull the trigger right now because I feel like there's a lot of good content coming out of his Substack, and I want to talk a lot about it because it's about a topic, religion and America, which I think a lot of people are interested in. I think this will be accessible to American and non-American listeners. Ryan, so before we go into specific topics, and there's all these specific things you highlight, can you kind of review the secularization of, let's say, the 21st century in the United States, the changes that you've been documenting over the years and that you've noticed? Give a general high level or a potted history for people who don't know about this field.
Yeah, so we think about, we break religion basically into 7 different categories. The biggest one I'm going to talk about today, obviously, is the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, non-religious people. These are people who identify as atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. In the farthest back we have good data is 1972. That's the General Social Survey began. So I'll use that as my timeline. In 1972, about 5% of Americans were nuns, and it stayed about that same number till the early 1990s. And then from the early 1990s till about 2020, it was just like hockey stick style growth. I mean, every year it was like 1% or 2%. And by 2020, 2021, the share of nuns got to 30%. Now, I just had a piece run on my Substack this morning that says that's slowing down now precipitously. And so it's not going to continue to have that hockey stick. It's going to plateau and sort of level off in the future. But today, about 30% of Americans are non-religious. Amongst Generation Z, which is people born 1996 or later, it's about 40 or 45% are nuns. But it seems like that's slowing down as well, too. There's other groups like the Catholic Church is about 20% of America. Evangelicals are 17% of America today, which is exactly the same size they were in 1972. They got to 30% of America in 1993, but then have gone down since then. And then the group that I'm the part of, which is called mainline Protestant Christianity, these are non-evangelical Protestants. So think of like Episcopalians, United Methodists, United Church of Christ. They were 30% of America in 1975. Today, they're 10%, actually 9% of America in the last data, and hurtling towards 5% very soon because they're very old and are dying off very quickly. Only 1.5% of Americans are mainline Protestant under the age of 35 years old. So there's really no future for my tradition in America.
Yeah, I have a friend that she does listen to the podcast sometimes, but she's Episcopalian and she is under the age of 40, and she's a very, very rare bird, and I make fun of her about that. She doesn't say anything about it because it's true. You said 1993, 30% of Americans are evangelical. Listeners of mine who are Gen X or older, especially I think Gen X, like me, younger boomers, we remember a very different America because of that 30% value in terms of, so I'm an atheist. I've always been an atheist. And it's just not really that big of a deal now. When I was a kid, it was kind of a big deal. There weren't that many. And it was, people didn't even know what the term was. and America just felt way more normatively religious. And so, if you're talking about a vibe shift, like you're talking about data, and I love data, but also vibe shifts are something you have to experience. And I think a lot of the younger millennial and definitely Zoomer, listeners to this podcast just do not have any conception how Christian and evangelical Protestant America felt sometimes in the last quarter of the 20th century.
Oh man, I was born in '82, so I grew up in a Southern Baptist church, which is like prototypical evangelical Christianity in the 1990s. So I was just bathed in the religious right and anti-abortion, anti-LGBT, and anti-porn and family values and anti-Bill Clinton and all those things. So like people don't understand how all-encompassing evangelicalism was in the 1990s. I mean, you could buy T-shirts, you could go to Christian concerts, Christian events, you could read Christian bookstores were all over America. It was like an entire you felt tucked in with evangelicalism. Everything made sense in the evangelical world. And evangelicalism is still strong today, but not in nearly the same cohesive way it was back in the 1990s. It's much more disparate. It's much more disconnected than it used to be. Like there used to be these events I would go to that 5,000 high school students, evangelical high school students, and now they have 500. It's like, where are all these kids going now? So evangelicalism is definitely the numbers are down, but also the vibes are down. It just feels like a completely different movement today than it did whenever I was growing up.
Yeah, I mean, people. Secular. I'm just gonna say secular liberals in particular. They didn't. Just for the context, I think most of the listeners know this, but I will just repeat. I grew up in Northeast Oregon. I had a lot of Mormon friends. I had a lot of Baptist, Presbyterian, evangelical type friends and stuff like that. And a lot of secular liberals. They don't know the differences between these different groups and just their affect, their beliefs, but also the social cultural implications. So, for example, all this talk about Christian nationalism. I mean, I don't know what you think, Ryan. I don't like the talk because it's just a big catch-all, and it seems to bracket a lot of different types of people, and I'm not sure how useful it is. Partly because a lot of the quote Christian nationalists are not very pious people in some ways. They're more cultural Christians. I don't know what you think about that.
Oh, I think that to me, and I've written a ton about this, right? Like I wrote a post called "I'm religious, but I don't go to church," which is like people are like, "No, you can't be religious and not go." I'm like, "Yes, you can." You're seeing a growing number of, for instance, among self-identified evangelical. These are people who, on surveys, will say they're evangelical. The share who never or seldom attend church in 2008 was 16%. Today, it's 27%. So we're seeing the rise of I like the idea of religion, but I don't like any of the trappings of religion. So what we're seeing is religion is a cultural marker. It basically means I'm a Trumper, I'm a conservative, I'm a right winger. It doesn't mean I go to church or I go to a specific type of church anymore. And I think that's how religion's changed in the lives of the average person now. It's been reduced like a tribal marker, is what I call it sometimes. Whether it be I vote for the Cubs or the Yankees, or I live on the West Coast, or that's what religion has become. It's really been devoid and stripped of all the theological precepts and really means nothing more than us versus them in a way to self-identify in the larger, diverse, American strata of, culture, economics, politics. It's I'm an evangelical. When you say that, you're saying I belong to a certain set of belief system that help me understand the world, not necessarily I go to church.
Yeah, I think one way I'd explain this to non-Americans is, I think America is a unique country in some ways. There are other countries like this, like South Korea, where traditionally your ethno-cultural identity, with some exceptions, obviously like Jews, is not tied to your religious denomination. And people change quite frequently in their lifetime, depending on where they move, their class shifts, and it's just not that big of a deal. Whereas in a lot of other countries, I have friends from Europe, they're very secular, but their family is from, say, a Protestant background, and, they don't believe in it, but to them, that's that's a legit religion. They think Catholics are kind of superstitious. They don't get all these evangelicals. And I feel like a lot of America, not all of America, but a lot of America is going more towards that. And it's an interesting place to be in 2024 because America was always exceptional in terms of, I'm going to say it's confessional, individualistic ethos when it came to religion.
Yeah, and I think for me, I'm a Baptist. My parents are Baptist. My grandparents. I don't tell anyone I'm a third generation Baptist, though. If I left the Baptist faith and became a Presbyterian, it wouldn't be some sort of national scandal or familial scandal in my life. You'd be like, okay, you're something different now. And religion just doesn't work. And if you actually look at the data, people are moving around religion today more than they ever have before. So, evangelicals are becoming nuns and nuns are becoming evangelicals, and a lot of Catholics become non-denominational Christians. It's actually a huge pipeline now. And like 40% of people raised Catholic don't end up Catholic as adults. So even in America, it's a much more volatile, we call it a marketplace. It's a much more volatile marketplace. People skip and hop around and jump around and pick something new. There's just not that much negative view. There's no stigma against changing a religion. Actually, I think in some ways you're kind of incentivized to do that because it makes you think like you're a free thinker. You're trying to break away from your parents', heritage and all those things. You're trying to find something new for yourself. So America's just a different marketplace. And that's also why I never get invited to give talks anywhere outside of America, because I specialize in American religion. It's just so weird compared to religion in the rest of the world for a whole bunch of weird reasons.
Yeah, and that does cause problems because we are, the imperial power. Like until recently, we're the hyperpower. I don't know if you could say that anymore. And I think Americans tend to impose their view of what religion is on other parts of the world where there's just a lot of disconnect, and that's caused a lot of problems, in my opinion.
Oh, I think that's always the problem is everyone thinks that we should, America, like we export our culture to other places. I think when it comes to religion, we do not do that at all. Actually in most parts of the world, I think in some parts of
Maybe
Africa,
in South Korea, I think is a little bit like America.
Yes, and I do think that sub-Saharan Africa has become more like America too. Like there's a documentary called God Loves Uganda, where basically a bunch of evangelicals went to Uganda and told them that God hates gay people, and now they're passing laws making sodomy like a capital crime. So there are ways but like there's parts of America, like American religion's not going to go to, like Eastern Europe. It just doesn't work that way. So, the thing about America is I like to tell people, like we were founded by a bunch of weirdos, and a lot of them were religious weirdos, including the Puritans. I think that strain runs through American theology and American politics. Like you said, we are a very individualized culture. And that's one of the reasons Protestant Christianity does so well in America, by the way, because it's a very individualized religion. You get personal salvation through Jesus Christ. Not because what your parents did or your grandparents did or what your church believes, what you do individually. I think there's a lot to be said about how America was founded on Protestant beliefs and how it drove us to do things like manifest destiny and embrace capitalism and all the things that make America the world superpower. I think at least in some part is due to our Protestant ethic.
Yeah. No, I mean this actually ties into a whole literature in evolutionary anthropology and cultural anthropology. I'm sure you probably know Joe Henrich's work about the weirdest people in the world. And it's not like explicit, but I mean, you talk to Joe, it's pretty clear. A lot of it, like Protestantism, Protestant Christianity is in some ways like the end, like terminal state of this hyper individualistic, rationalistic view of like viewing the world that's very exceptional in the world.
Oh, and we can talk all day about Max Weber's Protestant as in the spirit of capitalism, right? Like Weber argues one of the reasons Americans work so hard is because they're trying to figure out if they're saved or not. Because Calvinism taught you could figure out if you're saved by how much God blessed you on this earth. So what's a good way to figure that out? By how much wealth you obtain. And you want to live in a country that has low taxation and low regulation because it makes it easier to figure out if you're one of the elect or not. So really our entire system was devised as a way to figure out if I'm individually chosen by God to go to heaven when I die. And that's the reason that we have such a work ethic in America that most of the rest of the world doesn't copy, because we were trying to figure out our salvation. And now I guess you would argue that ethos has moved away from religion and just sort of like into the cultural bloodstream, like how we work so hard just because we're trying to figure out how good we are and what our worth is really, which is what Protestant Christianity is about in some ways. It's finding your worth.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to totally stick to this topic, but there's something I want to bring up, which I think a lot of people know implicitly. We're talking about Protestantism, and obviously it comes out of a particular history and a tradition, and we're actually talking about Second Reformation or radical Protestantism in that ways. We're not talking about magisterial Reformation and state churches like Lutheranism in the U.S. at least. We're talking about very individualistic churches, more like Baptists, maybe Presbyterians, whatever. Okay. But other religions in the United States have also taken up this. So Catholics have complained, very right-wing traditionalist Catholics or European Catholics, that American Catholics, they're not like real Catholics. They act like they're Protestant. I've talked to Muslims in this country where, let's just say they don't have like the standard Muslim beliefs and say like Sunni Muslims are supposed to believe in some sort of predestination, and they sound like Arminians. And I don't want to get into details, but it's like, you take any religion that comes to the U.S. and it does transform itself socioculturally into or reorganize in a Protestant way.
I think, yeah, I really think like we're like the sun and everything orbits around us in American religion. Like Catholicism has become more, everything has become. I mean, think about what the LDS, like the LDS is the American-made religion, right? Latter-day Saints. It's an American religion through and through. It's one click away from Protestantism, like on a whole bunch of metrics. I think that show, like even Scientology in a weird way, kind of has some Protestant strains to it. If you really want to get right down to it, like no, I don't think many religions can survive and go on a broad scale unless they're Protestant or Protestant adjacent. And like,
Sure.
okay, so think about this: non-denominational Protestant Christianity is the fastest growing religious group in America today. Okay, they were 3% of America in 1972. They're 15% of American adults are now non-denominational. That's the most American religion ever, because a lot of times it's a dude who's an insurance salesman starts a church in his basement with no theological training and no sort of like certifications from anywhere, and all of a sudden 5 years later, it's 1,000 people in a mega church with a huge gymnasium on the side of town. Like that is American capitalism right there. You have a good idea, you're charismatic, you're a good preacher, and you build a congregation. That is what the future of American religion looks like it or not.
Well, I mean, in some ways, it is already the present, right? Like this is how, like there are people you were saying who don't go to church who are religious. I would like to see like some sort of chart. I don't know if you already have one where it's like, okay, like how much of the religion experienced in America, how much of it is this type of religion, right? Because there are certain churches where people have like high attendance rates, other churches where they have low attendance rates and whatnot, and so there's like big differences in how you estimate the size of the religion and stuff like that. So I think like that's something to explore. But I want to ask you, because like people have different ideas about this, and I've read different things. What happened since about the year 2000, really maybe the starting of the late 90s, what happened to trigger this wave of secularization that we've seen since the 1990s, when, there was maybe a little bit of drop off since like the 70s, but really people thought America had kind of attained an equilibrium. And then, George W. Bush becomes president, and he's an evangelical president, and the Christian right is ascendant, and everyone's freaking out, and that's actually the beginning of the end.
So we point to a couple things in social science. One, so 1991 is the inflection point. Look at the data. That's where like it goes from flat to boom, up into the right. Couple things. One, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, right? Because you got to think before that, to be an atheist was to be a communist by default. Like you could not delink those two things in the American psyche. Like we added "In God We Trust" to the pledge and the money as a way to inculcate us against atheism during the Red Scare in the 1950s. Like that's what the goal was. So once communism falls, now you can be an atheist and not be a communist. It kind of takes that negativity away from it. We have to talk about the internet. I mean, you can't do this empirically because like everyone got the internet like a 3-year window of time, so you can all have a control group to really control against. But once you got on the internet, what you realize is a couple things. One, you can investigate other religions very quickly and very easily and get high quality sources on Islam or Buddhism or Judaism. You grew up in rural Illinois and don't know anything but Baptist theology, right? The other thing is, imagine you're an atheist born in Mississippi in 1950. You're never going to tell another soul that you're an atheist in Mississippi in 1965 because you'll get run out of town, out of your house, out of your job. But then you go on Reddit, let's say you're born in 1995, you go on Reddit and find a community atheist in Mississippi, and all of a sudden you realize, wait a minute, I'm not alone here anymore. There's a bunch of people like me, and it makes you more bold in your beliefs. So when you answer a survey, you're going to be more likely to answer honestly. And the third thing I'd point to is politics. I think politics, if you look at politics prior to the early 1990s, it was relatively calm and compromising. After the early 1990s, that's when Newt Gingrich and the Contract with America started in 1994, and people got really, it wasn't we disagree with the other sides. The other side's evil. And I really saw that growing up in rural Illinois as a Southern Baptist. It was like, no. Democrats are baby killers and they're evil. And we didn't see that before in politics. So I think what happened was you saw the political divide drive a lot of moderate people away from religion because they thought, well, can you be religious and be pro-abortion or be pro-same-sex marriage? It seemed increasing like you couldn't be beginning in the early 1990s. I think a lot of moderate people who kind of hung around for a while go, no, that's a bridge too far, and walked away from Christianity because it was becoming so right-wing during that time period. So it's a confluence of a bunch of events, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, when I was younger, when I was a teen, I would tell people I'm not religious, I'm an atheist. And one thing that would be interesting is, and I've always, by the way, I've always been libertarian conservative, so that's a whole different thing. In terms of my politics, I've always been kind of right wing, and I know you've written about Republican atheists. I have some experience as a Republican atheist, but
Having a
in any
meeting
case,
out there, yeah.
well, me and Heather McDonald, like, there was
Yeah,
now
exactly.
George Will, there. Well, okay, we can talk about that later. But like, what I was going to say though is, there were a lot of people who were like not very religious, but they would be like, oh, but like, you should at least like have a church or a religion. It was just the default thing to do. And some of the people that were telling me this, they lived very secular lives, in terms of their I don't know, their behavior. Let's just say that they were not living by the book, and so I was always curious about that sort of thing. I think that sort of hypocrisy, let's call it hypocrisy, is rare today. I think people that are just not living a Christian life, they don't have to, and they don't feel like they should say that they're Christian anymore. They don't. In the past, most people would say that. And, I would get like feedback from people, well, you should at least say you're Christian or religious or something,
Mm-hmm. I think this is actually a really interesting methodological question, because like, how do you measure religion? Like, that's something that I confront like every day of my life, because it's not one thing. We actually think of it as like three different spheres of activity. There's behavior, which is like going to church or like tithing or praying. There's belonging, which is like saying I'm an evangelical or I'm Catholic or I'm Jewish or I'm Muslim. And then there's the belief thing, which is like, what do you believe about Jesus or heaven or hell or the Bible or whatever it is? We know that people can be religious, very religious on one dimension and not at all religious on another dimension. People who belong and don't behave, or behave and don't believe. Like, we know there's a lot of people in church each Sunday who go on a regular basis who don't believe in any of it, but they go because they see the social benefits of it. I think what we've seen over time is the belonging piece has fallen away, because the thing that we're just talking about, people who say they're Christians but just didn't live by the precepts of Christianity because they really weren't Christians in any functional way, except they put on airs, right? That's just the label I give myself. I think a lot of those people over the last 20 years or so go, you know what? The facade's over. Like, I'm just a nun. I've been a nun for 20 years now, and I'm not going to say I'm a Protestant who never goes. And I think that's, in some ways, I tell people this is actually kind of comforting, because we're actually seeing what America really looks like. We were probably never as religious as we thought we were. It's just people lied a ton on these surveys about certain things and made them look more religious than they actually were. And what we're getting to now is the bare metal. We're really seeing what people are up to, because they're being more honest, because A, there's less, stigma against being non-religious, but B, surveys have gone online. And in my field, that's actually a really good thing, because people will not lie to a web browser when they lie to a human being asking them questions. So all that to say is, I think we're much closer to what's really happening in America with survey data than we've ever been, ever in the history of academia, as far as I can tell.
Yeah. I'm going to ask about nuns, but I will tell a quick story, which I think some of the listeners have heard before. I went back to my 20-year reunion, and so most of my friends, I was pretty straight edge in high school. So most of my friends by the end of high school were Mormon, Latter-day Saint. A lot of them went to BYU. At my 20-year reunion, one of my most Mormon friends, we met at a bar, and I saw she had beer in her hand, and because I moved away and I didn't really keep in touch with anyone, so I fly back to Oregon from Texas, and like, what's going on here? And she will explain the internet happened, and basically a lot of my extremely devout Mormon friends apostatized, although they were still culturally Mormon. And this individual, for example, she and her husband are both in belief they're apostates, but they go to church. They go to the church, and their kids go to church, and the kids also are basically apostates now too. But they really, the Mormon Church has. Like, the church league and like all the infrastructure of the churches, or, and so we're in a really strange place in America in some ways in 2024, where it's like, I don't really know, what to think and, how to anticipate things. That's what I'm going to say.
Yeah, I think, but I get the inclination for someone to do that, by the way, to be an apostate in belief, but still belong to a church because of all the things the church does. If you need an insurance agent, you go to someone in the church. You need a real estate agent. You need a dentist. You need a vet. Like, all these people are in the church, and they want to help you out because you know them on a friendly basis, not just a business basis. And I was just having a conversation earlier today when both my boys were born. I came home There's a casserole dish sitting on my front step. Some old lady in the church made me a casserole both times. And I think to myself, like, wow, like that really made our lives easier because we didn't have to cook
Yeah,
for a day or two because we had a casserole. Like, I think we have to remember that church at its heart is a social organization. Like, you got to think about the horizontal dimension of religion as much, if not more, than the vertical. When I say religion to the average person, I think they almost always gravitate towards belief. As a social scientist, I want to kind of steer the ship a little bit back towards the idea of the horizontal, the social gathering. And I think that's why a lot of people go to church, because it gives them a chance to socialize and give them a chance to plan something with their friends and be someplace with other people. Because think about how many third spaces we have in American life right now. The answer is
yeah,
hardly none. And religion is one of the very
yeah,
last ones, and it's collapsing rapidly. So we need a third space. I think we can all admit to that. We have to have
yeah.
something out home and work. What is that? I tell people, I go, listen, you don't have to go to church. I don't care if you go to church or not, but find a third space. I have not seen the non-religious community generate a third space in any way that matches what's happening in the religious world. I would love for them to do that. I just haven't seen that yet. And I think we
Sure.
desperately need that. That, to me, that's the bigger issue, is the socialization piece.
Sure. My friend David Sloan Wilson, evolutionary biologist, well, he's emeritus now, SUNY Binghamton, he's been talking about this for 30 years, and he's tried with various, I think, projects. I don't think they've succeeded, but yeah, it's difficult. It might not be possible. It might be, just from a purely instrumental viewpoint that you do need supernatural beliefs to kind of anchor these sorts of institutions and social technologies. I don't know. Actually, I'm going to ask you something. This is like not off on the list of what we were going to talk about, but I want to bring it up. Grades and, being religious, that correlation, and belonging or religious attendance versus belief. From what I remember reading the social science, like maybe like 20 years ago, is there was a weird pattern where it's pretty consistent that in most societies, kind of like the more, high status or like high achieving you are, the more socially maybe bourgeois you are, the more you're likely to go to church or belong to a church. But belief is not correlated in the exact same way, where there's like a much weaker correlation or maybe even a negative correlation. And I'm just wondering if that still holds, and like what's tracking in the United States right now.
Yeah, so this is something that I think, like, most people who don't think about religion very much think that, like, getting more educated drives you away from religion. And the answer is it does in some ways, but not in other ways. So belief wise, you're absolutely correct. People who have a higher level of education have a less certain belief in God. Which kind of makes sense, right? If you're taught to question everything and inquire and be inquisitive, it makes sense that you would not believe in God. But what we find is the people who are the most likely to be weekly religious attenders today, and this is across multiple surveys, hundreds of thousands of participants, are those with a graduate degree are more likely to be in a house of worship this weekend compared to someone with a high school diploma or less. And you can control for all kinds of factors, and that relationship still holds up. It also holds up on the belonging piece too, by the way. The people who are most likely to be nuns, which includes a group called Nothing in Particular, are people with a high school diploma or less. The least likely group to be nuns are those with a graduate degree or more. So what you can't answer it like in a quick little anecdote, because in some ways it makes you less religious, but in other ways, and part of this is, and this is a really important conversation to have, is education is positively related to interpersonal trust. The more education I have, the more likely I am to say that other people can be trusted. And if I say that, I'm going to be more likely to be social, like going to church. So it all sort of feeds this flywheel, right? More education, more trust, more education, more income, better connections, better mental health, all sort of like runs on these same tracks. And I think that when you see it that way, it makes perfect sense, right? Because if you look at why a lot of people come to church, they go for external reasons, which is to, climb the social ladder and get a new job or help your kids get a job or get into a new school or whatever it is. That is, people who go to church realize there's a lot of value outside the whole salvific side of things. And a lot of them don't even believe in the salvific side of things, but they can see tangibly the real value of being in a community of people who are different than you.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna tell one more story before we talk about nuns, and we'll talk about nuns next. When I was in high school, I'm not, like I said, I'm an atheist. I'm not religious, but one of my teachers wanted me to do the Islamic prayer for the school because my family's Muslim, and so I know that. And I was like, I don't believe in this stuff. And like my teacher was like, basically like, look, Razib, I go to the Presbyterian church because my wife makes me. I don't believe in any of that crap either. You know what I'm saying? So just like go with it. So I was like, okay. I thought that was funny. But speaking of no religion, the nuns, there's massive growth of nuns over the last generation. Could you talk about that growth and then talk about what you're seeing of the leveling off and why?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's the biggest cultural shift in my lifetime in the last 40 years. Going from 5% of America to 30% of America is just and here's what's even fascinating about it is you don't get to 30% of America by just being one thing. You can't get to 30% by just being a bunch of white dudes or a bunch of people of color. Like you got to be a little bit of everything. Now, primarily the nuns are rising amongst liberal people, left-leaning people. So, for instance, amongst people who identify as liberal, almost half of them are nuns today. Amongst people who identify as conservative, is about 12%. So we call that the Pew gap or the God gap. It's just the idea that the Republican Party has become the party of Christians, typically white Christians, and the Democratic Party has become the party of nuns and then non-white Christians. So Black Protestants, Latino Catholics, things like that. So what we're seeing is it's growing amongst every racial group too. So for instance, amongst white people, it's about 35% are nuns. Amongst Black people, it's about 35% are nuns. The group that's the least likely to be nuns are Hispanics, but we're talking like 32% instead of 35%. And then amongst Asian Americans, it's even higher. They're in the 40s to low 40s when it comes to being non-religious. And really, like I said, if you look at like regionally where it's happening all over, but it's predominantly happening in the Northeast and the Northwest. So Oregon, Washington in the Northwest, and the Northeast, it's places like Vermont, Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts. Obviously, religion is still very strong in the South, especially the Southeast, the Bible Belt. And it's also pretty strong in the Southwest too. So places like Arizona and New Mexico and Texas. But even places like that, you're seeing 25, 30% of Texans have non-religion now. And it's here's the thing. It used to be that most kids who are raised in a non-religious household would grab onto religion into adulthood. So only about a third of kids raised nuns were still nuns as adults in the 1970s, which means that 2/3 became religious. It's actually flipped. And now 2/3 of people raised nuns stay nuns as adults. So what we're seeing now for the first time in large numbers are second and third generation non-religious Americans, which is something that we have no conception of because it didn't exist until the last 30 or 40 years. So all that to say that we're in this really interesting moment in American history. We're trying to figure out what a group looks like as it's growing rapidly and changing rapidly. We're trying to study it as it's doing all these metamorphosis. And we're really in the beginning stages of understanding non-religion in America.
Yeah, it's interesting when you're saying the rapidity. This is a phenomenon that's like exploded over the last 25 years, the last generation. Other types of researchers, are examining trends that are happening over centuries, thousands of years. And, the slope on their graphs are, you have to do this fit and all these things. And you're talking about stuff where you could start writing a book and then 3 years later, at some point, some of the stuff would have been outdated, right?
I wrote the first version of the Nuns came out in 2021. I had to write a new edition 2 years later because things were changing. And now with the new data that just came out in the last 6 months, I've got to write a new version of the Nuns as the nuns are not as rising as fast as we thought they were going to. And they sort of hit this plateau now. So like it's literally like the plane is flying and we're building it like as it's taking off, which is really exciting, by the way, but also terrifying.
This is just-in-time scholarship.
Well, that's the thing about, not to go off on the Substack conversation too much, but like to do this conversation in academia would take 18 months. To get the data, to write the article, to get it through peer review, and to actually get it published would take at least 12 to 18 months. On Substack, I got that data on Thursday. I wrote the post on Friday. It ran on Monday. So you're getting this information like almost in real time for when it was collected, which I think is such a tremendous value to the general public that they wouldn't have had, even 10 or 15 years ago because of just the slow, very just frustrating process academia is.
Well, okay. So I was, just like listeners know, about a month ago, I was talking to Christian Johnson. He's an archaeologist in Denmark. And, he basically, telegraphed a paper or a preprint that was going to come out soon. It's, whatever. It's interesting to people who are interested in ancient DNA, which me and my listeners are. Okay. But someone pointed out in the comments, when they were young, this sort of result would have taken 10 years probably to percolate out into the public sphere. Whereas today with the podcast, he just previewed a preprint to a bunch of people who are super interested in the topic. So, we complain about the internet. Jonathan hates got that, stuff about smartphones, but there's good things about the rapidity of our information flow, right?
I will give you one caution about that, though. And that is, we talked about Christian nationalism a couple of minutes ago. If you look in the academic literature, there was almost no mention of Christian nationalism before about 2017 or 2018. And now it's like what everyone wants to talk about in my world of religion and politics. That idea kind of jumped the fence from academia into the public discourse too quickly. Before it was completely baked, like before we understood the measurement very well and the right scale construction very well, we didn't theorize it very well. So like we're like having this debate in the public sphere when usually that'd be hidden behind the ivory tower for a while. And when it was pretty ready, much more developed and understood, then it would jump the fence out into the public discourse. And I think that's one of the reasons that Christian nationalism has become so problematic, is because it got out too quickly before we were ready to really conceptualize it in a meaningful way. So, I think it's generally good that we're doing scholarship in public, right? Getting it out to the general public and doing public facing scholarship. But there are downsides that we need to figure out how to mitigate, or at least be more thoughtful about going forward.
Sure. Well, let's just do a little bit of epistemological hygiene. You're a scholar of religion. You're a pastor. Tell us. I mean, this isn't like, again, it's not on the list, but there's so many topics to talk about. Christian nationalism. Tell us what it is and what it ain't.
Yeah, so that's the problem, is it's hard to figure out what it is. So it's the idea that America is a Christian nation that should be run by Christians, and there's especially white Christian nationalism. And the problem is, like, the original measures for it were not created to create a Christian nationalism scale. So I had questions like, we should allow prayer in public school. That was actually one of the 6 statements that like kicked off this whole conversation, which is a ridiculous statement, because prayer is allowed in public school and always will be. Like, that's just a foundational part of free speech, right? But it was part of this scale. Now, on the other side of it, like, I've seen people say that, yeah, my vote should matter more on election day because I'm a Christian than a Muslim or a Hindu or a non-religious person. Now, to me, that's crystal clear. Like, I don't think it's like, obscenity. Potter Stewart was asked, what is obscenity? He goes, I don't know how to define it, but I know it when I see it. The problem with Christian nationalism is, like, I don't know how to define it in a way that makes everyone happy, but I can point to you examples where I go, no, that is definitely Christian nationalism. And other examples where I go, I'm not so sure that's Christian nationalism, kind of based on the context. We're getting better scale development now than we had, but it's still a work in progress, because it takes a long time to try these out. You got to fundraise, you got to get grants, you got to run the survey, you got to run it 3 different times, you got to validate. So I think in 5 or 10 years, we're going to have a much better scale that we almost all can agree on Christian nationalism than we have right now.
All right. Yeah, that makes sense to me. So you, speaking of like just-in-time scholarship, so the nuns are possibly leveling off. Can you talk about why you think that is? Because you did offer some hypotheses.
Yeah. So I think one of the way I described it is, we've scraped off all the loose topsoil over the last 20 or 30 years of American life. So the marginal Christians, the nominal Jews, the people who are just like kind of Catholic in name only, over the last 20 or 30 years have decided, you know what, I'm really not Catholic or Protestant or Jewish. I'm really non-religious. And what you got the low-hanging fruit basically over the last 20 or 30 years, and what you're left with is the bedrock. And the bedrock's not going to become a nun. Like, these are hardcore Catholics and evangelicals and Jews and Muslims. They're not changing. So I think what we saw over the last, 30 or 40, it's like a winnowing process in the wheat and the chaff, to use a biblical reference. And we saw as a lot of people who are marginally attached now just say they're nuns when they've always been nuns, or probably approximate to nuns over the last 20 or 30 years. I think going from 5% to 30% is a heck of a lot easier than going from 30% to 50%. I don't think that's very likely, because the people who are left are now really true believers, and they're not going to become nuns on a whim or because of politics or anything else. They're going to be Protestants or Catholics for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, I think for the biologists out there, I think what we're seeing here is it's a basically a logistic type growth pattern where there's initial slow rate of change, then rapid rate of change as the social norms are changing, and everybody who's accessible and within those social networks are flipping. But eventually, you kind of run out of the raw material, and you're hitting people who are in different social networks or more resistant. And I think for a religious example, look at South Korea. South Korea is pretty much like leveled off over the last probably like the 10 to 15 years in terms of the proportion who are Christian, Catholic plus Protestant, and I think it's partly just because you're seeing the carrying capacity in South Korean society of how many people are going to be Christian. And, they're obviously influential, they're a big deal, they're overrepresented in the elites, but, South Korea is not going to be 80% Christian, it seems, from what we can tell.
Oh, I think it's the same thing always been true in America. We just lied about it for a long time. You know, we were 90% Christian in 1972, according to the GSS, but we weren't in any meaningful way 90% Christian in terms of people functionally going to church and believing in Jesus and things like that. I think that what we see in every society is like, I think we're actually getting in some ways back to like what's really happening in America. And the problem is now we look back, a lot of evangelicals do this a lot, go, oh, back in the day, we were really religious. Like look at nostalgia for the 50s and 60s. I want to tell them we were never as religious as we thought we were. It was all just a facade. And even if you look back at like, for instance, like I think Truman said, I want people to be religious. I just don't care what kind. Like that's not what evangelicals say, right? Like that's not how they think about religion.
Yeah.
So, you know, like I think in some ways we recreate the past in an image that we want it to be, and then are really sad that we're not there. We were never there. That past never existed in America.
Sure.
If you look back at the colonial period, for God's sakes, more women gave birth within 9 months of being married than were members of churches in New England. So like they were not paragons of virtue at any point in American society. We just we create this weird reality. And I think that's the problem is nostalgia is like cancer in a lot of ways, because it's wanting to go back to a place that never really existed. And I think America's never been as religious as we thought it was.
Yeah, I would say, and you can disagree with me, Ryan. We can talk about this. One thing I would say to evangelicals, and this is not all evangelicals, but this founding of Christian America and whatnot. I think it's pretty clear that the founders and the founding generation, they had various levels of belief or orthodoxy, however you define it, but they were culturally Christian. So even like, Thomas Jefferson's Jefferson Bible, which, at that time, Jefferson was basically a Unitarian, although later it became a more conventional Episcopalian, still like Christian Protestant assumptions, right? And, the original, like many of the early presidents, like you would not say that they were atheists or anything like that, but they were not particularly devout. And in America today, if you have like an evangelical Southern Baptist, they would not be the type of person that they would say that those Southern Baptists would say is a Christian, right? And so it's like a subtle thing because culturally they're clearly Christian. They probably still go to the Anglican Church or whatever. Some of these, Virginia, these Virginia aristocrats, but they were not like the low church evangelical Protestants that we see in the American South today.
What's so funny is people go, what's the most religious president we've had? And I go, like, by what metric, right? Like, Joe Biden, by the way, has gone to mass more than any president's gone to church in my lifetime. Like, he is easily the most, like, devout in terms of behavior. But then you go back and you look back in history and go, okay, like, think about, like, who's been president. Obama was mainline Protestant, but, like, barely. Kind of like classic mainline Protestant. Like, he went every once in a while. Bill Clinton was the same way. He's Southern Baptist, but he really didn't go to church. I mean, Reagan was not in any way religious. George H.W. Bush was Episcopalian. Like, Jimmy Carter was really an evangelical, but, like, a moderate evangelical. Like, he wasn't, like, a hardcore right-winger.
Well, he left the Southern Baptist.
Yes, over gender. Exactly. But if you look at most of our presidents, they're exactly what you just described, which is culturally Christian, but not really functionally religious in any way that like evangelicals would respect. And I think that's what the founders were. Like Ben Franklin believed in reincarnation. George Washington only went to church to get votes. He actually left because the pastor got mad at him one day. They were not religious. You know what I mean? They weren't religious in a way that we would go, oh, wow, they're really devout. They were Christian because everyone else was Christian. It was just the thing to do for educated aristocrats. And I think that is understanding that makes us understand history a whole lot better, that we don't make this like plea to, oh, we had real Christian roots. No, we had the same Christian roots today as they had back in those days, which is generically Christian, but not any functionally religious in, any meaningful way.
Well, okay. So I want to ask you, I have said before, Obama and Trump were kind of an interesting sequence because, Obama said in his book that he believes in, his biography, I think he said he believes in evolution more than he believes in angels, which is a very weird thing for a Christian, in my opinion, to say. And then Trump, he's definitely a cultural Christian, but in some ways, I think Trump is in the last generation, the most secular American president. And I think that's really changed a lot of things, on the right in the Republican Party, even though it's still the Christian party, there's a lot of schizophrenia, especially with the younger people that I know on the right, where, the sort of Bible Belt Christian coalition evangelicalism is just not as dominant as it was, during, say, the Bush administration.
Oh, just think about the last couple of Republican candidates. You got Trump, who we just talked about, was born Presbyterian, but really not Presbyterian. And then he became non-denominational, by the way. That's what he said, which is whatever. And then you got McCain, who is in no way, you don't think of McCain and think of religion. Guy wasn't religious. And then you got Romney, who was incredibly religious, but in a way that most Americans don't respect, in that he's a Latter-day Saint. So like the Republican Party, a paragon of white Christianity, is running candidates who are not really functionally white Christians in any way. It's the weirdest thing if you think about it. Like they cannot find a candidate who they can, and I guess here's what a lot of them would say. Evangelicals will tell you this right now. We like Trump better because he ended Roe. Bush was an evangelical, but he didn't get anything done. He really didn't want to end Roe at the end of the day. He wanted to tell us he was going to end it, but actually didn't do it. Trump was an empty vessel and gave us what we wanted on abortion, which means I don't care what you believe. I care what you do, and you delivered for us, so therefore you're one of us. And I think that's why evangelicals have embraced Trump in a way they've not embraced most other Republican candidates, because he actually got them a meaningful win that changed their lives in ways they think it changed their life.
Yeah, I mean, render unto Caesar. I mean, sometimes, even a Gentile or a pagan ruler can, serve the cause, or work God's way in the world, I think is the way they would say it. I don't know. I mean, it's very interesting, because you're right. There is a, shall I say, cult-like devotion to Trump among American evangelicals, which is the inversion of the extreme aversion that you can see among secular, the professional managerial classes, even the center-right secular professional managerial classes.
Have you heard the King Cyrus analogy with Trump? You ever heard this before?
Oh, okay, yeah. Go explain that for the listener.
So a lot of like far right evangelical charismatics believe that Trump is like the next iteration of King Cyrus. So the Israelites, they were destroyed in 586. They were destroyed by the Babylonians, and many of them were taken into exile into Babylon, so they couldn't revolt against the Babylonians. And Nebuchadnezzar was the king at the time. Well, eventually what happens is the Jewish people are living in Babylon. The Persians overtake the Babylonians and take that land for themselves. King Cyrus was the Persian king, and he allowed the Jewish people to return back to their homeland and rebuild the temple. So for them, like Trump is, Cyrus was a non-Jewish person, but worked God's will for the Israelite people, just like Trump is not a religious person, but is doing God's will in a different way that gets to the same spot. So that's a lot of evangelicals think that, we don't care what he is, we care what he does. And he did good things just like King Cyrus. He worked for God's plan and God's kingdom, and look what we got out of that.
Yeah. No, I mean, that makes sense, because I was a little shocked. I think, people of our generation, that Roe was overturned, and, now it's like the new normal, good for Democrats in some ways, to be honest, politically, but, it's a big transformation. Trump went there partly because, he isn't a politician, and he probably doesn't understand what should or shouldn't be done, as opposed to what you say, right?
So here's an interesting stat. This is not my stat. This is from Sam Perry, who is a great scholar of Christian nationalism. He did a survey and he asked a couple different questions about abortion that you don't typically see. One is, do you think abortion is murder? And then another one was, do you think women should be jailed for seeking an abortion? You know what percentage of Americans think both abortion is murder and women should be jailed for seeking an abortion? You want to guess?
How about 10%?
It's 6%. 6% of Americans believe abortion is murder and women should be jailed for seeking an abortion. That is what we're talking. Like, if you're in that 6%, like from a Christian nationalist perspective, you say, I don't care. We need to change the law to reflect God's plan. But you got to convince 45% of Americans, right, to adopt your viewpoint to win through a democratic process. That's the issue that Christian nationalism faces. They either have to convince people or shove it down their throats. And a lot of Christian nationalists will say, no, I'm fine shoving it down their throats because the law is a teacher. So we'll use the law as a weapon, basically, to teach people about morality. And I can say that the vast majority of Americans disagree with that perspective, because they think at the end of the day, Vox Populi, Vox Dei, right? The voice of the people is the voice of God. Yeah. And 95% of people disagree with you. And so that's got to tell you about where we are as a society.
Yeah, I have friends who are Christian nationalists, and not only is Christian nationalism like associated with these sort of beliefs, these authoritarian beliefs you're talking about. The demographic locus of Christian nationalism is in a particular type of reformed, Calvinist Protestant Christianity, and it's interesting because they have issues with the trad Caths, who they are aligned with in many ways, the traditional Catholics, and it's it's a self-marginalizing, honestly, I've told them this, it's a self-marginalizing movement, because at the end of the day, you're not going to stone the gays, remove citizenship from non-Protestants, and all these weird fantasy LARPing. It's a little bit like the DSA and come the revolution. It's just not going to happen.
I think that's like that. The self-limiting thing is the key here, right? Like how far are you going to get as a politician saying we should end no-fault divorce, make pornography illegal, make abortion, a crime for everyone involved? Like what percent of Americans are like, yeah, sign me up for that stuff? Like, I think at some level they've got to realize they're fighting a mission that's impossible. You're not going to win over more than 10 or 15% of Americans to any of those viewpoints, especially like 3 of those viewpoints at once. So like, what is your purpose? And I think that's what especially evangelicals, they've been really dealing with this problem for a long time. Do they just kind of like go on their own enclave over like and pick a state and make it super, super conservative and just live there and be happy? Or do they try to like affect national politics? I think for the last 30 or 40 years, they've chosen option 2, which is like to go out in the world and try to change politics in their own image. And in some ways they've succeeded, but in some ways they've been miserable failures and actually probably hurt the name of Christianity, especially evangelical Christianity in America, because a lot of people felt like it got shoved down their throats and they weren't persuaded by it. They were told, here's what you're going to do. And a lot of Americans just frankly don't like that very much.
Yeah, I will say, not editorializing, but I think, decentralization and kind of like devolution to the states, I think that's the only way that we can really have a little social peace right now, because we are a very diverse country. We don't have unanimity, kind of like the public facade that you were talking about of, oh, everyone's actually a Christian and all this stuff. That's collapsed. We have like legitimate religious diversity, ideological diversity, a lot of negative polarization. And, the way I explained it to people is like, Texas exists, Florida exists, California exists, New York exists, Iowa exists, all these different states with different configurations exist. And maybe we just need to understand that it's going to be different. I live in a state that's functionally pro-life now. I live in Austin, Texas, and it's functionally pro-life. And that's just how it is. I'm personally not pro-life, although I'm not, like super pro-abortion rights either, but I'm definitely not pro-life. But I choose to live in the state. There's trade-offs, obviously, and that is how it is. And other people, I have friends who are traditionalist Catholics who live in California, and obviously there's trade-offs there. But, in general, people are moving with their feet and they're going where they can, can go. And I will say the really great thing about Texas and Florida is the housing is accessible and cheap. And I do think that my friends in Blue America, and, they're trying to make changes. They're trying to make California's trying to pass laws, but they need to think about like what they're doing when they make housing inaccessible to basically the whole younger generation that's not working at a FANG company. So I'm just a little off topic there, but I think let a thousand flowers bloom, and, like have the laboratory of states, kind of proliferate, because I think that's the only way that we can maintain peace, and that's just my take.
I think we should really lean on the budget or the ballot referendum and initiative, right? Like if you want to move on abortion politics, I think every state should put it on the ballot. Put a 16-week ban on the ballot, 20-week ban, and let the people decide. And if 51% of people vote in favor of that, then that's what you do. Like, again, Vox Populi, Vox Dei, right? Like the voice of the people, the voice of God. Let the people decide on these contentious issues. And honestly, if I'm a politician, I want that to happen, because now when they say, oh, you're killing babies. No, I'm not killing anybody. You voted to kill babies. You know what I mean? Like, I'm just reinforcing the view of the general public on this issue. I don't know why politicians try to stand in the way of what the public wants so often. And if there's 50 different states, let them all have initiatives and referendums on gun control and abortion and same-sex marriage and transgender and whatever you want it to be. Let the people decide, because at the end of the day, when people go, oh, this system sucks, go, yeah, but you made it suck. You know what I mean? You're the ones who voted for this stuff, so it's your fault. I think, moving towards a more federated system is probably the only way our country survives as we become more and more ideologically and religiously polarized too, by the way. There is no compromise on the position that abortion is murder. Like, how do you can't navigate a democracy where your position is abortion is murder? How do you agree with an atheist who says, no, I don't even believe it's a life? You can't make those two views are incompatible with each other.
Yeah, incommensurable.
Exactly. And actually, I'm writing a book about this called The Big Church Sort, where it's basically making the argument that we're careening towards a future where on the right, you're going to have a cloistered group of evangelicals and tradcasts and conservative Muslims and conservative Jews and LDS. On the other side, you're going to have a whole bunch of nuns who hate religion and want to not have a privileged place in American society. And the main line, which used to dominate American life in the 50s and 60s, is going to be gone, functionally disappeared. So all we're going to have is people who hate each other on each side and look at the worst version of the other side. How do you compromise on the big issues of our day when you don't have any space in American life where people can debate and discuss with people they trust and just disagree with? Those spaces don't exist. And the church has never been perfect, don't get me wrong. But it used to be very diverse politically, educationally, culturally, and now it's all one note. And I think that's really, really bad, not just for religion, but for the health of a democracy.
Yeah, that's it's dark, but it's true. So let me ask you. I was looking at the data, and there's huge generational differences, which you've written about. Actually, I'll tell you guys a quick story. I was talking to my sons. They're in elementary school, and just to give you a demographic, it's like kind of the type of elementary school where the parents are professors or doctors or lawyers, very like upper middle class professional. And I asked them, and my kids are not being raised religious. My wife is an atheist as well. Any case, so I asked them if they know any religious kids because they were. Well, my daughter was in an elementary school that had a fair number of evangelical kids, and there were some religious arguments that were kind of weird when 5-year-olds are doing that, but whatever. And my sons were like, not really. And then they were like, oh, yeah, there's some Jewish kids, and they know that they're Jewish because they're not there during certain holidays. And that's about it. So, I mean, I think there are some religious kids, but it's so low key and low salience that, my 9-year-old and 7-year-old they think they don't know any religious kids except for the Jewish kids.
I think that's that's. Can I just say, I think the bigger issue is a lot of people are not exposed to different religious groups, and there's something called social contact theory, which is just the basic idea. Like, someone from a different group, you become more tolerant of that group. It's not just like Muslims as an idea. It's like the guy down in the cubicle next to me is a Muslim, and he's a good dude, works hard, treats his family well, tries to be a good American. So therefore, I don't think Muslims are bad. Like, we've got to be exposed to people that are different than us, especially religiously. When I was in college, when I was 18, we went to Chicago, and we went to a Catholic church. We went to a synagogue, a mosque, the Baha'i temple, a Black Catholic church, an Episcopal church, a mosque. That was one of those transformative experiences for me, because I realized that at the end of the day, we're all trying to do the same thing, and that's find transcendence, whether you find it here, there, or everywhere. And those people are different than me, but different is not bad. Different is different, and that's okay. And it's always made me comfortable when I walk in any house of worship now. I'm totally fine whether it's a mosque, a synagogue, or a church. I don't care, because I know what I'm there for, right? I think we need a lot more of that in American life, because it opens our eyes to the idea that at the end of the day, we're all just people striving for something, trying to make our lives better, live a more meaningful life. And I think when we only cloister ourselves to people who think the same, worship the same, believe the same, and vote the same, I just don't think that's going to create a good democracy for us in the future.
Yeah. No. Amen, brother. So I guess the last question I want to ask you is, we were talking about like the generations, right? So they're getting more secular. Actually, a couple of last questions. So is it true? My understanding is people in a given generation don't get that much more religious, and in fact, your data seems to show that like some of the silents are getting more secular, like as they age. Because a lot of people are saying, looking at your data, well, who cares if Gen Z is 35% nun? A lot of them are going to become more religious as they age. And then the second issue is looking at the leveling off of the nuns and whatnot. Do you think that the U.S. in the next generation is going to hit 50% or less Christian?
So, actually, in 20 Myths About Religion and Politics America, one of the myths that I bust is that people become more religious as they age. If you break the data down into birth cohorts, which are like 5-year birth windows, and look at like 2008 versus 2022, which is like the farthest I can go, almost every, not every, but like 90% of birth cohorts are less religious today than they were in 2008. And even amongst like boomers and silent generation folks, people born in the 30s and 40s and 50s, are less religious today than they were 15 years ago. Well, the problem is when you go to church, you see a bunch of gray-haired people and go, oh, they must be coming back to religion as they age. They've been there the whole time. You don't see the people who aren't there. There's a lot of gray-haired people who aren't there that you just don't see. So that's kind of a big misconception. Now, so when we think about what the future American religion looks like, if you see what's happening with the millennials and Gen Z, they look almost exactly the same religiously, which is fascinating because we're talking about being born in the late 70s versus the mid 90s, which is like a huge change technologically in America. I think we're going to get to about 45% none and stick there for a long time. We can't go above that because that's what Gen Z and millennials are. About 45% of them are nuns. So even if the boomers start dying off and they're only 28 or 30% nuns, you can't get above 45% because that's what the youngest generation is. Now, could it go up from there? Theoretically, but I just don't see a future in my lifetime where like 55% of Americans, 60% of Americans are non-religious. We have that core, that bedrock of people that aren't going to move. And I think America has a bigger core than almost any country on earth of very devout religious folks.
Okay, so it's going to be about a 50-50 nation is what I'm hearing.
I think so. And the 50% is going to be a lot of nuns. But by the way, now that doesn't mean 50% atheist agnostics, by the way. It's probably going to be it's like 10% atheist, 10% agnostic, and 30% of people who call their religion nothing in particular. And then the other 50% is going to be like mostly Protestants and Catholics, and then a smattering of Muslims, LDS, Jews, and sort of everybody else. That's what America looks like in probably 2070, I would bet.
Oh, so the whole you're talking about communism and atheism and kind of like the social stigma with the term. I'll tell you a story which I think is Julia Sweeney, the comedian, was talking about. But a lot of people have told me things like this, where Julia Sweeney told her mom, I think she was raised Catholic, was like, I'm an atheist now. I don't believe in God. And she's like, Julia, you know what? Don't believe in God, but did you have to be an atheist? So it's just the term has such negative connotations, or did, that a lot of people that I knew personally, where it's if I kept pushing, they clearly didn't believe in God. They would just admit it, I don't really believe in God, but they didn't want to call themselves atheist. I think that's decreased a lot over the last generation.
So what's funny is if you actually look at the belief question, the GSS has been asking a belief question since 1988. If you look at people who never attend religious services, they're just as likely to say that they're certain that God exists as they are to say that God does not exist. About 20% of them pick both options. So even amongst it's really 90% of people believe in God at some level. They don't pick the atheist or agnostic view of God. And even amongst atheists by belonging, not all of them, only 2/3 of them are atheists by belief, which just shows you how weird no one has a coherent worldview on this stuff. It seems like you just kind of randomly pick and choose how you feel on certain topics. So when people say, are we religious? I have to say, I don't want to be pedantic, but what do you mean by religion? Because it makes a vastly different answer if you mean church going people versus people who believe in a higher power. We're talking 40% of people never go to church, but 90% of people believe in God at some level. So we're somewhere between those two poles, and that's a much different conception of America.
Yeah, so I live here in Austin, Texas. It's a very liberal city. Because I have I run in somewhat more conservative circles. I have good friends who are religious, but most people here are not religious. A lot of people will say atheist, but some of them not. I remember talking to a friend of mine, he's a graphic designer, just conventional liberal Austin person, and we were talking about ghosts and whether he believed in ghosts. And he said, I was like, oh, do you believe in ghosts? And he's like, yeah, of course I believe in ghosts. And I'm like, why? And he said, because I'm human. And I'm telling you that story because it's just for a lot of people, it just makes sense to them, whether they're religious or whether they go to church or not. These sorts of things make sense to them.
We actually have a survey in the field right now. The Templeton Foundation gave me a whole mess of money. I'm doing a survey of 16,000 Americans, and 12,000 are non-religious. And we ask questions about the soul. What happens when you die? Do you have a soul? Does it go somewhere? Do you believe in heaven and hell? Do you believe in karma? What goes around trying to figure out what is the contours of spirituality in America? Because I want to know what percentage of Americans are just don't believe in any of that stuff, right? No soul, no heaven, no hell, no karma, no ghosts. Nothing. They don't have crystals. They don't do tarot. They don't do any. They literally have no spirituality or religiosity at all. I bet you it's a vanishingly small number. We are still, for whatever reason, a deeply spiritual, if not religious people. We still believe in all this stuff, and it's so funny. Of course, I believe in ghosts. I'm a human. It's almost like you have to believe in supernatural things. That's just the American ethos. It feels like.
Yeah, no, I'll tell you as one of the soulless people, and I've always been like this, we are truly few and far between, in spirit is what I'm going to say. There are people who, fancy themselves heterodox, and when you dig, they are but human as well. So, there's ironically, we're talking about differences and polarization, all these different beliefs, but it also comes back to there is a common humanity, and that's kind of going to what you were alluding to when you were saying you were different, houses of worship, and yet, there's a commonality, there's a universality there. And, maybe ending on a hopeful note, we can reflect on that. And, you're talking about being exposed to different types of people. I know I try to do it myself, and I do know different types of people. And, I try to bring different types of people onto this podcast. I had Ramesh Ponnuru, a conservative writer and thinker, talk about the pro-life movement. in like I think January of 2021 before Roe v. Wade was overturned, and I just got some interesting responses because a lot of my audience who are scientists had never really heard an articulate, intelligent, because he's obviously very smart, pro-life person, So I thought that was just interesting.
I'll give you a story about that. We were talking about that in one of my classes. I always start my class by saying, what's going on in America? Let's talk about it for a little bit. And we were talking, this is like during COVID, coming out of COVID, we're talking about, vaccine mandates. And, people are like, no, you should be able to get, you should have to get the vaccine. And I was like, okay, like under what pretense? And I go, yeah, but what about when people say my body, my choice? They go, well, no, that shouldn't matter here. I go, but what about when women say that when it comes to abortion? And my students are like, wait a minute. Like, you know what I mean? Like they saw the
awkward. Yeah, they saw the analogy.
Exactly. They never have heard the pro-life argument articulated intelligently to them. Like they've never heard, like when I explained it in the Catholic view of sanctity of life at beginning, middle, and end, a lot of them go, okay, I can respect that. I don't know if I agree with it, but I can respect it because they hear it, like from a theological perspective and like a holistic perspective. They go, okay, you know what? You are anti-death penalty and anti-abortion and anti-euthanasia. That all makes sense to me. Not that I agree with you, but I respect your viewpoint because it makes they've never heard it, explained in a meaningful, thoughtful, academic, intelligent way. It's only the worst version of that argument they hear on MSNBC or Fox News, not the smart, nuanced, intelligent. And that's the problem, I think, is we don't hear the other side done well very often.
Yeah. I mean, I 100% agree with you. Everyone should go at the strongest arguments that they disagree with. They should, engage with people who aren't clowns or entertainers, because that's what a lot of these quote unquote public intellectuals, these talking heads are. They should engage with, the text or, just the speeches of people who are actually trying to put thought in, because over the long term, the din of the noise and the clown shows, they fade away. What we do remember are the substantive ideas. Like those will persist over time, even if they are a little softer and quieter in the present. I mean, that's what I would say to that.
Oh, the marketplace of ideas is one of those powerful. Think about like the idea of, you said like in 1850, you said, hey, black people are not animals, they're people. You got laughed out of a lot of places in the South, right? Or women should have the right to vote in 1900. A lot of people say absolutely not. Or gay people should have the right to marry each other in 1980. But now all those arguments are accepted as just being like, well, of course. Like that's, of course. How could you believe anything else? Like if you have a good idea, persuade people that you're correct in the marketplace of ideas. That's why I don't believe in shouting people down, by the way. Like we've got to allow even if you hate the idea, you've got to be able to hear the idea. And that's the thing. We've got in America, we should respect free speech. You should say, I believe in God, or I don't believe in God, or I believe in Muhammad or Moses or Buddha or whatever. You should be able to have your voice heard. And in America, if you're a good, effective, if you're intelligent and effective communicator, you can change people's minds. That's how society changes. And that's also why I'm very reluctant to say like we should make abortion illegal because God says it's illegal. No. Convince people that this is God's design for life and then pass legislation and most people agree with you. That's how we should legislate. That's how religious people should act in a pluralistic democracy. Unfortunately, a lot of people have given up on that. And I think that's just such a failure of discourse. And it really betrays what the founders put us together for.
Well, you definitely are a pastor in terms of your ability to communicate these ideas, which I think, I want to end it on this that hopeful note. Although I did not, I think, shill enough for your book, so I do want to do that really quickly. So you have the nuns, where they came from, who they are, and where they're going, and I guess you have 2 editions of that right now, and it's in. Yeah, and it's in like audiobook and Kindle as well as like regular book formats. And the same with 20 myths about religion and politics in America. And I guess that came out 2 years ago?
2 years ago, yep.
Okay, and they're still all valid myths.
Oh, most of it's actually become even more prominent in the last couple of years. So yeah, absolutely. And then a book last year called The Great De-Churching, which is actually with 2 pastors about like why people left. We did like this $90,000 survey of why people left religion. Most expensive survey I've ever been part of, which talks about why people left religion and what would bring them back. I've got a textbook with Oxford coming out next year, just called The American Religious Landscape, Facts, Trends, and the Future. I signed a contract with Brazos Press to write a book called The Big Church Sort, which I just mentioned, which will come out in 2026. And then the Substack, right? That's how we all got here. Graphs about religion, graphs.religion.com.
Yeah. So everyone should check. I mean, I mean, whatever. I'll link to the Substack, but everyone should check out graphsabout.religion.com. It is, there are things that people read that are addictive and kind of like, page turning type that it's kind of like empty calories. And then there's other things where, you learn something. And I do think, I'm going to say this like totally sincerely, and candidly, like you learn a lot on your Substack. I mean, Ryan, you are a great communicator. You're kind of, I think, what we need more academics to be. Like you're obviously just very open minded, and you're passionate about your scholarship. You're not a snob about it. There are some people who only talk to other academics and all this, like, it has to go through peer review and whatnot. Obviously that's good. I think we should have a plurality of venues to consume intellectual, let's say, product, right? But I think it's really great that you put it out there for the people, because this is about the people, right? And it's great that they can know about themselves through these various venues, and you have books and all these other things. I think a lot more people should be doing what you're doing, and you show that it can be done. And I'm really glad to have you on the podcast, because I think you're going to be a much bigger deal later, and I can say that I had you on the podcast when you were just starting out.
Several people have told me that over the years, and it hasn't happened yet. So I'm kind of like getting this like feeling of like, is it ever going to happen? But listen, I've got, my Substack was read 1.1 million times in its first year. I've got almost 10,000 subscribers. Like I've had more success in my life than a kid living in a first generation college family in rural Illinois could ever expect. So I'm just happy to be here, man. It's been a great ride, and I'm just so pleased that people actually care about what I'm writing about. At the end of the day, that's all I really cared about going to grad school. I wanted to write what people needed to read and understand about the world, and explaining things to people is really my gift on this planet. I just want to share it as widely as I can. So I appreciate everything you've done for me and giving me the platform.
Yeah, for sure, man. You're blessed, and we're blessed to have you. So I will see you online later.
Thanks, guys.
If you have a sibling with autism, your future child's risk for an autism diagnosis is increased by a factor of 2 to 3.5. Orchid's whole genome embryo reports can help mitigate your child's risk by screening for over 200 genetic variants, definitively linked to autism and other neurodevelopmental disorders. Discuss your situation with a genetics expert.
This podcast for kids. This is my favorite part.